Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Started by a group of citizens in a small Michigan town with a like-minded goal
of increasing the visibility
of the unseen and unheard populations in our community.
Our guests will share stories and insights
with the goal of increasing our awareness and knowledge
of various aspects of diversity and equity
to create a more connected, empathetic, and inclusive community.
So, let's get to work.
Let's get to work.
So let's get to work.
So let's get to work.
Let's get to work.
In this month's episode, we will be joined by Tabitha Spencer and Desirea Woodworth as we focus on the topic of child abuse, trauma, and victims' rights. Tabitha started with the prosecutor's office in July of 2019 as a victim rights advocate and has recently taken on the role of a victim rights coordinator. She is passionate about providing assistance and support to victims. She attended Saginaw Valley State University, where she received her bachelor's degree in social work. In her spare time, she enjoys spending time with her 2 fur babies and enjoys boating on nearby lakes with her husband. Desirea graduated from Central Michigan University with a Bachelor of Science in Child Development and Family Studies. She spent 3 years in prevention work as a child abuse prevention education specialist at Safe and Sound. She has recently transitioned to the role of forensic interviewer. She brings a wealth of knowledge concerning child development and experience with family partnership to the agency. She is a nationally certified darkness to light facilitator and child passenger safety technician who is dedicated to keeping our children safe and continuing to advocate for children and families in our community. Well, welcome, Tabitha and Desirea. I'm so happy to have you both here and to get to know you both and to learn from your experiences. So welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
So today, the first thing I'd like to do is to get to know you both a little bit more and for our listeners to get to know you a little bit more. So I'll start with you, Tabitha. Could you just maybe give us a background about yourself, about your personal life, and a little bit more about your professional life? I know we'll dig into that more in a second too, but yeah, tell us more about yourself, Tabitha.
Yeah, certainly. So Tabitha Spencer, Victim Rights Coordinator here at the Prosecutor's Office in Midland County. Personally, I am a family of 4, my husband and our 2 fur babies. So we enjoy a lot of outdoor activities, trying to keep the dogs active.
I'm Desirea, and I work at Safe and Sound Child Advocacy Center. We are Midland County's Child Advocacy Center. I've been there for going on 4 years now. I spent 3 years as the Child Abuse Prevention and Education Specialist, and then I switched over just recently to be the forensic interviewer there. My personal life, I've got 2 dogs, 2 guinea pigs, and 2 wonderful children. So that keeps me quite busy.
I imagine.
Yeah, so that's a lot of fun, and I really enjoy my work at Safe and Sound as well.
Awesome. Well, I'd like to dig into both of your work experiences a little bit more. So Tabitha, I'm going to circle back to you here. Can you dig in a little bit deeper and tell us more about your experiences working in victims' rights? And if there's any really specific examples from your experiences you'd like to share, we'd love to hear those as well.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that can really share as far as experiences go would be our canine advocate, Joey. He's an 8-year-old chocolate lab. He is a huge supporter for our children that we have as victims on cases. He is able to go to court with them and even be on the stand with them and up to the age of 16. So there have been specific instances where Joey's been on the stand with a child testifying, and he can be going from sound asleep and then recognize that they're struggling and lift his head up and put it on their lap. He just is very good at sensing those things. So I think one of my favorite parts of my job is working with Joey as his handler and just offering as much support through our program as we can.
I'm sure that really helps the kids as they're having to testify into such an emotional and hard thing to do. So on a day-to-day basis too, can you talk about what type of things you're doing on a day-to-day basis a little bit more?
Yep. So as I mentioned, a lot of it is appearing in court with our victims and their families if they are minors. So it would be parents, guardians, things along line. A big role and a big responsibility for us is keeping victims and their families notified of what's going on with the court process. And so there's a lot of phone calls that are made and email communication, old school snail mail communication. We still use that too. So just being an ear and somebody that is here and available for them to call if they have questions or if they're looking for updates on a case or if there's things that just don't make sense about the criminal justice process. Then that's really one of our big roles here is to be available for them and to answering those questions and kind of talk through things with them.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Tabitha. And Desiree, I'm going to shift over to you for a similar type of questions here. So can you tell us more about, your experiences and your work, and if there's also any specific examples from your experiences you'd like to share with our listeners as well?
Yeah, so I've got kind of a unique perspective, having worked in both our prevention and our intervention at Safe and Sound. So working as the child abuse prevention and education specialist, one of my favorite parts of my job was going into the third grade classrooms in Midland County schools and providing our personal safety lessons. Research indicates that receiving personal safety lessons encourages children to disclose any past or ongoing abuse. So the lessons that we do kind of give those students a clear message to report any unsafe or abusive situation to those safe adults that they trust. And we practice those skills too. So one of my favorite parts of my job ever basically has been how, and I'm going to restart that part. Okay. So my favorite part of all of that is when I can go into those classrooms, I can practice those skills, and I find out later that a child has gone to their teacher and reported unsafe situations at home. And so knowing that those lessons that we're giving are actually having an immediate impact on those kids, they're realizing, oh, I just learned that's unsafe or that's an unwanted touch. And when I have those, I have to report to my safe adults. And so then they're able to come into our intervention program and get a forensic interview, and the suspected abuse and neglect can get investigated by our multidisciplinary team. So to kind of see everything come full circle is really impactful.
Wow, that's amazing. And then it's really, really important to have those trained for the kids so they know what to do in those situations. So it sounds like it's really paid dividends as well. So that's amazing. Thank you for sharing. So as we dig in deeper into our conversation today, one place that I always like to start on the Visibility Project podcast is really talking about, definitions and making sure we have a good overview of what we're talking about here. So can you teach us a little bit more about what the correct terminology would be when we are discussing both abuse and child abuse, and what you all both deal with on a daily basis in your field? So are there any terminologies or definitions we should be using, or maybe some terms that we should avoid?
I think one of the big things is that when you're talking about abuse, especially with children, it's okay and it's helpful and beneficial if people are talking about their body parts with the correct terms. So in letting a child express their certain body parts and talk about them appropriately, so that when everyone's having this conversation, everybody's on the same page and we know what's going on. So I think that's a really big thing. And I can't speak for Desiree, but I believe that at Safe and Sound, they teach that as part of that is, this is this and this is that. So, just so that we're all on the same page and we understand when a child's explaining what's going on with their body or what's happening to them, that it's okay to say these words. It's not taboo. So that's a big thing that I think we see a lot of times, is that children are afraid to talk about their body parts because they've been kind of taught that it's not appropriate, it's not okay, but it is okay.
Sure. Desiree, do you have thoughts? Is that what you at Safe and Sound as well?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely what we think. Penis and vagina are not bad words. They're a body part like anything else, like my elbow and my nose. And it's important that when we're talking with kids, we make them know that too. So there's not any inherent shame or things like that keeping them from talking about it. And I think in general, language really matters. We really need to be clear when it comes to abuse. So just when you kind of see things, even just in the media, there can be conflicting languages used in headlines when you're reporting child abuse or child sexual assault. And I think it's important that we watch the language that we use, because a child cannot consent. And so if you see headlines, Florida teacher jailed for allegedly having a sexual relationship with 14-year-old, where it can't be a sexual relationship because they can't give the consent because they are children. So it's important using the exact terms like sexual assault, sexual abuse, rather than sexual relationship.
Makes sense. Thank you for that clarification. And I guess continuing on, when we talk about abuse, really, can we start from there? Really, what is abuse? And like, can you define it for us? And what does it look like? And is there a thing that can we answer that? What does it look like even, or what would you define it as for us and for our listeners?
I think there's kind of 4 commonly recognized types of child abuse: physical abuse, the intentional use of physical force, sexual abuse, which is involving a child in sexual acts, emotional abuse, kind of behaviors that harm a child's self-worth or their emotional well-being. And then there's also neglect. And neglect is actually the most common type of abuse that you see, but it's not always talked about. And that's just the failure to meet a child's basic needs.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That's super helpful to understand like the differences between them, and it's not a one size fits all essentially, right? Tabitha, do you have anything else to add on that front as well, or?
No, I think that Desiree hit the nail on the head on that one, especially with the neglect part, is that it is very common and probably, one of the hardest ones to kind of pinpoint and address, because it is kind of a standard depending on who you're talking to, of like where does that fall? So, and she said, meeting their basic needs, which is extremely important. And we see that that's not being done a lot, unfortunately. So.
Do you happen to know, is this in Midland County, at least in Midland County, Michigan? I know that our listeners come from all over, not just Midland County, but in Midland County, Michigan, where we're based for this podcast. Do you happen to know any trends? Is reports of abuse, is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Is it status quo? Do you happen to have any insight into that within our specific region? And similar to that too, do you guys happen to know if there's like any statistical trends about who are perpetrators, and are there major trends of this? So yeah, I'll start there about in general in our county, what are the trends? And then maybe like following up on that, is there any specific statistical trends of who are perpetrators in these situations?
So I think one of the things that I've recognized, and it's not necessarily that I have numbers to support it, but just in the 3 years that I've been here, I think that I've recognized a trend in the abuse of children that we're seeing being more severe. Cases that we're seeing come through, they're just more extreme than what they may have been just 3 years ago. As far as, perpetrators and their trends and what that may look like, I think there's a big stigma and a myth that these sexual predators are strangers and they're people you've never met. Don't talk to strangers is what children are taught, but more often than not, we see that they're people within the same household, they're family members, they're close friends, they're, as Desiree stated, they're their teachers. And so it's really important where those conversations are coming in that Desiree's program is having with students and explaining what a safe touch is and what an unwanted touch is and that type of thing. So it's often a stereotype that people think it's just these strangers that are coming in out of nowhere and they're just, taking advantage of these children. But unfortunately, what we see more often than not is that it's people that they know and that they're trusting.
Do you have any thoughts then? You said that you're seeing in your time, you've seen the severity of these cases being increasing. Do you have any thoughts, like even anecdotally, why you think maybe why there is more severe cases, or is it just waves? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. It's hard to say specifically, but it's not just in our child abuse cases. We're seeing it in a lot of our domestic violence and in assaults that are happening between non-related individuals. It seems that there's a higher level of stress in the last couple of years. The pandemic has taken a huge toll on people. And so, I don't have the specifics to say, yes, this led to this, but it just seems the timeline very much matched up with the pandemic and the stress that that people experienced due to being not working, kids going in and out of school, the economy changing, things like that. So I think there's a lot of contributing factors, but if I had to guess, like the timeline matching up with the pandemic was a big thing.
Desiree, I'm going to ask you as well, do you have any additional thoughts on any trends that you see, or any thoughts as well on this idea of there being a stereotype of certain, perpetrators, or any trends in that as well? Any thoughts?
Yeah, so I'll just kind of think about some trends that we've specifically seen at Safe and Sound. So we have seen an increase in our forensic interviews. Our biggest jump from 2020 to 2021, we saw a 66% increase of forensic interviews at our center specifically.
Wow.
Not all of these end in a disclosure of abuse, but I think it's important to recognize these are all suspected abuse or neglect cases. And then from 2019, which would be before COVID, we still saw a 34% increase. So we're definitely seeing an increase in forensic interviews that we are performing here at Safe and Sound. When it comes to the relationship of the alleged offender to the child, it's exactly like what Tabitha said. A lot of times we get that stranger danger, a myth, it's the guy in the boogeyman or the guy in the black trench coat, and you can pick him out from the thing. But what we saw specifically in 2021 at Safe and Sound was most of the time it was a parent, a step parent, a parent's boyfriend or girlfriend, an other relative, or an other known person. Less than 1% were strangers at our center in 2021.
Really? Less than 1%. Yeah, that really dispels this stranger danger is what we're taught as kids, right? It really interesting. So is there any other myths or stereotypes surrounding abuse that you'd like to touch on? Because that's a huge one, right? This stranger danger. I mean, yes, certainly we want to be mindful, but it sounds like that's less than 1%. So are there other myths or stereotypes that we should be aware of that related to abuse that you'd like to highlight as well?
Yeah, I think with the stranger danger, nationally, they say this statistic is only 10% of abused children are abused by a stranger. So that's like the national statistic. But in terms of other myths that I see and stereotypes kind of related to abuse or child abuse, a lot of times you'll hear like child abuse doesn't happen in good communities. And I'd like to think that Midland really recognizes themselves as a good community. And so sometimes this myth comes up a lot here. But it doesn't matter what kind of neighborhood, town, or community we're a part of. Children everywhere are at risk of abuse. It's not because of their location, but because there's adults that exist in that community that look for that opportunity. So it can happen in all socioeconomic backgrounds, races, religious affiliations, or educational statuses. It happens everywhere. So I think it's important to know and recognize, no matter how awesome our community is, our children are still at risk.
So, as we move on, right? So when you said when we start to notice these things, right? When Desiree, when you said what we should be aware of these things. So I guess what are some signs that we, like the listeners, what are some signs should we watch for? And then if we do suspect abuse, what do we do in these situations?
I think one of the big things is just if a child trusts you enough to come to you and say something, believe them. That's extremely important. Here in Michigan, we have kind of a central registry hotline that's available for anybody to call that has a suspect of child abuse in any form. And so really reaching out to the services that are available and the appropriate people that need to be notified so that the things like the forensic interview can be set up and handled. The law enforcement can get involved and start to do their piece of investigation. So just recognizing that if a child's coming to you and saying that something's happening, to really listen to them and to believe them.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Desiree, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there can be a lot of indicators that abuse or neglect are happening. And a lot of times they'll be kind of dismissed of, they're just going through a phase or they're having a hard time. But if a kid is having a sudden change in behavior or showing extreme behaviors, strong anxiety, depression, low self-esteem. They're kind of more withdrawal than they are normally. A lot of those are good indicators that something is up. And so it doesn't always mean that it's, abuse or neglect or things like that, but it does mean it's time to have a conversation, an open-ended conversation. Hey, what's up? What's happening with you? I'm noticing these things. I want to be there for you. Because a lot of times we see is all the signs are there. And even when families come in and they meet with our family advocate at Safe and Sound, they'll talk about these things that they've been noticing. And then they'll look at the list of indicators and everything kind of starts to match up, but people aren't looking for it there. So they're like, well, I noticed something was up, but I never thought it was this. Because we like to think it's never us or it's never our family. It can't happen here. So I think just sudden changes of behavior or extreme behaviors, big changes are things to look for.
Actually, that's really important. You're right that nobody thinks it's going to happen in their families, right? So it's important to know what to look for and what to do in those situations. So on that same topic, like who do you, this is really a broad question, but to both of you really, whose responsibility is it to recognize abuse? Who do you think, who is it? Is it all of us? Is it like, who's responsible is it to any situations?
Yeah, I think that there's not anything preventing anyone from taking that responsibility. Sure. So if you are, kind of goes to the mandated reporting. Yes. If you're in a position where you oversee children, teachers, where you see them as a doctor or a family care provider, counselors, things along those lines. If you're in a position where you're working with children directly, you're mandated to report anything that you suspect is potential abuse. If it's best to go with your gut. And so I think, again, anybody that is in a position, even if they don't have a role, employment or professionally, that forces them to be a mandated reporter. I think an aunt, a cousin, a grandmother, anybody can report this. If they see something going on with a child that they know, I think it's part of their responsibility to speak up and to say something and say something's not right. And I feel like this should be addressed.
So really this idea of who is a mandated reporter really is not just related to profession, but really anyone who really those to empower to be able to do so, correct? Is that what I'm hearing? Yeah. Desiree, I'll pass it off to you too on thoughts on mandated reporters and whose responsibility is it to really recognize abuse from your perspective as well?
Yeah, so I think it's important to recognize that just because a law states certain adults are considered a mandated reporter doesn't mean you can't consider yourself a mandated reporter. At Safe and Sound, we talk about what it means to be a safe adult and how important it is in the community to be a safe adult for our kids. And so child abuse, it really thrives when good people decide it's none of their business. So if we could just have everybody say, you know what, it is my business. This is my community. I care about these kids. And I see something that I just feel like is not right. And they just took it upon themselves to say, I may not be required by law to report this, but I'm required by my own values to report this and to do what I think is best. Some states, they do have laws that all adults are considered a mandated reporter. And I really wish it was that way here in Michigan.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with you there. Now, I guess moving on, like you both are so ingrained in this and really, this is what you like, it sounds like you're living and breathing this daily. So can you tell us, like for myself and all our listeners, what is being done in our community in general to one, like really help with prevention efforts? And then two, what is being done in both while this is all happening and also post abuse, like for support of victims? So can you talk about really from both a like individual perspective, from a programmatic standpoint in our community, what are some resources, what is being done across our community to both help with prevention efforts and helping and supporting?
I think that from my professional standpoint is that while we're working with a family, we really initially want to make sure that there's some services in place to support the child and support the parents, because frankly, a lot of times when a child has experienced some sorts of trauma or sexual abuse or physical abuse from someone other than the parents, they oftentimes are going through a lot, kind of indirectly from seeing their children experience. So making sure that there's some support, counseling, different classes and services. We have a great local shelter here, an agency that supports anybody who's been a victim of domestic violence and sexual assault. And so we really try and make the connection for them to get involved with that place, with that program. And then just to kind of make sure that while we're working with them for the criminal case process, that by the time they're, kind of passed off to the next agency, that we've helped to at least, if they want it, to at least try and get them connected with that support and in the appropriate people that can continue to work with them through their process of healing in working through that trauma that they've experienced.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. And Desiree, on your end, like any thoughts on support and prevention efforts community-wide?
Yeah, so I think that the Midland community in general is very lucky to have a lot of resources. I think if we're just talking about when it comes to prevention in terms of that, I think a lot of people think prevention is something different than what it is. When it comes to preventing child abuse and neglect, there's a lot of strategies you can follow, whether it's strengthening supports for families, providing concrete supports in times of need, changing social norms to support parents or positive parenting ideas, providing trauma-informed trainings, providing quality care and education early in life, and then intervening to lessen harms and prevent future risks. So there's a lot of strategies that go into preventing child abuse and neglect. And I think we've got a lot going on in the Midland community. There's trainings that you can take to help not only learn how to recognize and report child abuse and neglect. There's trainings on how to have a trauma-informed community. There's conscious discipline trainings that are put on by our Great Start Collaborative. So there's a lot of resources in the area to give yourself the education that you need to make sure you're supporting our community and our families and our children. And through all of those tiny little efforts, you're working to create a community where children are protected.
It sounds like there's a lot of resources in our community, and it does sound like we're very lucky to be in our community to have all those resources. And I'd encourage our listeners with any of our podcasts, we have a resource guide associated with each of our podcasts. So please check that out, and we'll have some of these located as well. Continuing our conversation about focusing on how to support. I know that our listeners may be curious how they can help and support. What would you recommend for our listeners to do next? Like to if they're interested in supporting and learning more?
I think that people underestimate the impact they have on their own small circles. So even in your own life, if you are being that safe adult example for your friends and your family, you're having those hard conversations, you're talking with kiddos early and often about their bodies, about body safety, about just safety measures in general. And you're kind of modeling to other people that hey, this is how I handle these situations, or these are conversations me and my kids have. You're just kind of breaking down the stigma of, we don't talk about child abuse. We don't want to talk about this. And that puts a lot of shame on victims of child abuse when we do that. So if we just bring it all to light and we all learn to have these tough and hard conversations, I think we're going to see a really big difference in our community. So focus on your small circle first. Don't try to go do big things. Your impact is already really large if you just kind of learn how to use it.
Wonderful. I think that's a really great advice to start with our small circles, right? It doesn't have to be the world. Tabitha, do you have any other advice on that, like maybe our listeners could do if they really want to support and learn more and do more?
Yeah, I maybe just kind of want to elaborate a little bit more on what Desiree was saying about those conversations. If we're as adults not comfortable speaking about body parts and rights and wrongs and that type of thing, then we can't expect our children to be comfortable enough to talk about what has happened to them, these traumatic experiences. So if we make it an okay conversation and just lead by example, not only to the small circle and the other adults, but also the children in our lives, because they're going to grow up eventually to be adults too. And then they know, okay, it's okay for me to talk about this, and be able to go to somebody if something is happening. So I think just leading by example for the children and saying, you know what, if something's wrong, it's okay to talk about this. It's not taboo.
And I know we're changing a culture when it comes to all of this, But we have at Safe and Sound a ton of resources on how to have these conversations. You don't have to know how to do it. We already have resources for you to help you figure out these conversations and navigate them. We have them broken down by age and developmental level. So if you're having these conversations early and often, we've got guides for you to show you, okay, how are we going to have it now that's appropriate for this age and their level? Okay, now we're here. The conversation has to shift a little bit. Maybe now we're with the teenager and we need to start talking more about consent and what consent looks like and how I give consent. And so these conversations change, and you don't have to figure out how to do it all yourself. A lot of people have already done a lot of work to put this together. So there's resources out there to help you have these conversations.
So really, another question I have that I wanted to see if you had some insight into is I really feel like this can often be generational, right? So those who are victims of abuse, if that really can be generational and passed down as a legacy, and it really is a trauma that is passed down. So when it becomes generational or these issues, what can be done in these situations? How do we break that cycle? Difficult question, right? How do we break that cycle? But do you have any thoughts in regards to this? What can we do as both as individuals and society to help? Because it does seem to continue. What can we do in these situations?
I think a lot of times it's going to require professional support. Cycle breaking is not easy, and it's not usually something you're able to do on your own. So I definitely recommend professional support, mental health services, and then just in general, what can you do to help as a person is support your friends, support your families, be that supportive person, understand you have no idea what people are going through and what they're working through right now. So I think just being kind and supportive individuals goes a long way.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Tabitha, any thoughts on that as well? Or
Yeah, I think that, just as Desiree stated, just making sure that when we come into the picture, we as in Desiree and myself in our offices and agencies, is just making sure that there is a connection to those resources and services available so that if this is something that the people that we're working with do want to break the cycle, they have that support and they have the information in the people there that are going to help them walk through that. So I think that's really important just to make sure that they're aware. As we've talked about, we are a very resource-rich community. We're extremely fortunate to have so much support and so many programs here in Midland. And so just making sure that people know what's available to them and how to take advantage of those programs.
So as we wrap up today, I wanted to ask both of you, what would be your final thoughts for our listeners? What would be your final message? And then what would be your ask to our listeners? What would you want them to take away from this and to do after listening to this episode? So I'll start with either of you and I'll ask the same question.
I think that my biggest takeaway from this would just be being comfortable with having those conversations, using the appropriate terms and being a listening ear for children in the community and your friends, whether they're adults or children, and just being supportive and compassionate towards them. And again, if a child is coming to you and saying something's happening, or if you're recognizing those extreme changes in behaviors, whether you are mandated or not, do what you can to get that child some help and some attention and intervene so that if there is something in fact going on, that it can be addressed.
Wonderful. And Desiree, what are your thoughts?
I think that my just final call to action would be to really think about it. If you are part of a family or if you're with kids a lot, just kind of be more vigilant of what you're aware of, because we've talked about a lot. So it's 90% of the time, it's somebody that they know and trust. And that probably means you know and trust them too. So kind of be watchful no matter who it is, and kind of have just a level of, I'm always this watchful, regardless of who it is. It doesn't change if it's this person, or if it doesn't change if it's this person. Having kind of a family code of conduct of, this is how we handle sleepovers, or this is how we handle who watches our children, or this is how we handle trips to the park. Or even this is how we handle kids alone together. Do we have the door open? Do we have the door shut? And just having a basic rule that you follow with everybody so that you're being vigilant regardless of the situation. We don't want to go around and be paranoid that it could be anybody, but we also want to make sure that we're doing our best to just keep them safe in all situations and not kind of let our guard down just because it's somebody we know and we trust. Still follow your gut and follow those rules and your intuition.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for being here today, for sharing your knowledge and your experiences and your expertise in this. And really, thank you again for being here today. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks. I'm just so happy that you're kind of shining light on this topic. So I'm just really grateful to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You can stay connected with the Visibility Project by subscribing, liking, and sharing on your favorite podcasting and social apps. Look for us at the Visibility PRJ.
Financial support is needed to keep the conversation going. Go to midlandfoundation.org/give and select the Cultural Awareness Coalition Endowment Fund to be part of the project. Note podcast in your donation notes.
Thank you for listening.
We see you.
We hear you.
And together, we are making a difference.